The deadly job of a Victorian-era baker. Hey everyone! Tonight we're drifting back to the 19th century. So go ahead and dim the lights, settle in somewhere warm, and let the day slip away. We're going to spend the evening in Victorian Britain, where the bread was cheap, the flour was questionable, and the bakers were slowly poisoning people. Bread, of course, was the foundation of the working-class diet. If you were poor in Britain in the 1800s, bread wasn't a side dish. It was breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Sometimes with a splash of tea. Sometimes with a bit of drippings or jam, if you were lucky. But bread was the thing that kept you alive, or, more accurately, the thing that kept you sort of alive, while quietly shaving years off your life expectancy. The Victorian baker was caught in an awkward position. On one hand, he was essential. A pillar of the neighborhood. On the other, he was expected to produce mountains of cheap bread at a time when flour quality was poor, wages were low, and customers could barely afford anything better. And like so many industries of the 19th century, the solution involved creative shortcuts. Which is the nicest possible way of saying adding toxic substances to food and hoping nobody notices. So let's take a sleepy wander through the world of adulterated bread. We'll meet the bakers, the buyers, the regulators who did nothing, and the customers who had no choice but to keep eating poison, because hunger is rarely picky. Now, bread ought to be simple. Flour, water, yeast, maybe some salt. But in Victorian Britain, it quickly became a chemistry experiment. And not the fun kind, with colorful beakers and sparks. More the depressing kind, with powdered chalk, plaster, and the occasional handful of arsenic. The core problem was this: flour was expensive, and bakers were under pressure to keep bread prices low. So, to stretch the flour, they started bulking it out with other things. Ground beans, potato starch, rice flour, sawdust. And if that sounds unpleasant, just wait. Because stretching wasn't the only trick. Bread had to look good. In the Victorian imagination, the whiter the bread, the better. White bread meant purity, refinement, the food of the genteel classes. Brown bread was for peasants. So even the cheapest loaves were expected to look as pale as possible. Which is how bakers found themselves reaching for whitening agents. And when you live in an industrial age obsessed with powdered substances, the possibilities are endless. Chalk was a favorite. Nice, white, easy to grind. Of course, it wasn't food. But it was cheap, and it made loaves brighter. Alum, an aluminum compound, was even more popular. It gave flour a dazzling whiteness and made bread feel firmer and heavier, which tricked customers into thinking it was better quality. Alum was also toxic. But, you know, small details. Plaster of Paris, yes, the stuff used to patch walls, also made appearances. So did ground bones. And on some truly special occasions, bakers got hold of arsenic, because why not? If your bread could both fill a stomach and slowly compromise the digestive tract, well, efficiency. And here's where we should pause, just for a moment, to picture the life of the average Victorian baker. It wasn't glamorous. These men, usually men, though women ran some shops, rose in the middle of the night to mix dough. They worked long hours in hot rooms, sweating beside their ovens. Their margins were razor thin. And their customers were poor, sometimes too poor to pay at all. A baker could hardly turn them away, but he couldn't give bread away for free either. So cutting corners wasn't just greed. It was survival. This doesn't make it better, of course. It just adds a layer of bleak inevitability. When the choice is bankruptcy or chalk powder, many bakers shrugged and grabbed the chalk. And the government? Well, the Victorian government was largely occupied with other matters. Like making sure poor people stayed poor. Or expanding the empire. Or holding long speeches in Parliament about the moral dangers of working-class gin. Bread adulteration was technically illegal, but enforcement was virtually non-existent. Inspectors were rare. Prosecutions rarer still. For decades, bakers and millers operated in a fog of unofficial tolerance. Naturally, reformers tried to raise the alarm. A few chemists, most famously, a man named Frederick Acum, started testing food samples and publishing horrifying lists of what they found. Acum's 1820 book had a wonderfully direct title, A Treatise on Adulterations of Food and Culinary Poisons. Subtlety was not the order of the day. He made it clear that yes, your bread might literally contain poison. Yes, your milk might be watered down and whitened with chalk. Yes, your beer might be laced with opium. Victorians, being Victorians, were mildly horrified, and then went straight back to buying the cheapest loaf they could find. Because horror doesn't fill an empty stomach. Bread does. Even poisonous bread. Let's drift for a moment into the home of one of those working-class families. The mother slices bread for her children. The loaf looks pale, heavy, respectable. She doesn't know it contains alum, or that alum interferes with the absorption of nutrients, or that long-term consumption weakens the body. All she knows is that her children are hungry. And for a few minutes, as they chew, they're not. Doctors noticed, of course. They wrote about digestive troubles, malnutrition, wasting illnesses. But malnutrition in the 19th century had so many causes: poverty, sanitation, overcrowding, that poisoned bread just became one more factor in a long list. The irony is that the middle and upper classes, who could afford better bread, were less exposed. They bought loaves from reputable bakers, or even imported fancy flour. So the whitening agents in chalk tended to hit the poor hardest. It was, in other words, perfectly aligned with the grand Victorian tradition of making life worse for anyone without money. By the mid-century, chemists were loudly pointing out the problem. They performed tests in newspapers. They compared pure bread with adulterated bread. They published columns urging the government to act. But Parliament, full of wealthy men who weren't eating chalk bread themselves, moved slowly. Finally, in 1860, the first real step was taken: the Adulteration of Food Act. This law made it illegal to sell food not of the nature, substance, and quality demanded. Which sounds promising. Except the act had no teeth. No dedicated inspectors. No penalties strong enough to scare bakers. It was more like a polite suggestion than a law. It wasn't until 1875, with the Sale of Food and Drugs Act, that meaningful enforcement began. By then, 2 or 3 generations had grown up on chalk and alum. Which may explain why Victorian portraits often feature that pale, slightly haunted look. Malnutrition chic. But let's not leave our bakers behind too quickly. Because they really did have it rough. Imagine the schedule: you start at midnight, mixing dough in the dark. You bake until dawn. You haul hot loaves into the shop just as customers are waking up. You work through the day, catching scraps of sleep when you can. Your clothes reek of yeast and smoke. Your skin cracks from the heat. And your lungs, by the way, fill with flour dust, leading to what was called baker's lung. Baker's lung was a slow, suffocating condition. Constant exposure to flour dust inflamed the lungs, leaving bakers short of breath. Many died young. Others worked through chronic coughing fits, dust clinging to their hair, their eyebrows, their mustaches. Imagine a ghostly figure coated in white powder, standing behind the counter. It was the flour. It was also, symbolically, death creeping in early. So yes, if the customers were slowly poisoned, the bakers were not far behind. They were poisoned differently, by their work environment. Which feels almost poetic, in the bleak Victorian sense of poetry. Every now and then, scandals erupted. A batch of bread would cause widespread illness. A newspaper would expose a particularly egregious case. There were whispers about millers cutting flour with ground Derbyshire spar, a white mineral that looked nice in bread, but happened to be mostly heavy metal. And yet, the machine of daily life rolled on. People still needed bread. Bakers still baked it. And reform crept forward at the pace of a lethargic snail. Eventually, with better regulation, the worst practices faded. But the reputation of the Victorian baker remained ambivalent. Half saint, half poisoner. Feeding the masses, but at a cost. And perhaps the most telling detail is this: when alum bread finally disappeared, people didn't necessarily notice. Bread was still bread. pale loaves remained the ideal. The public, it seemed, had adapted so thoroughly to being poisoned that normal food felt unremarkable. So that was the Victorian baker. A man caught between poverty and poison. A worker whose lungs filled with flour while his customers' stomachs filled with chalk. A reminder that history's progress is rarely neat and rarely kind. And with that, let's drift gently toward the next royal fiasco. The entire life of Julius Caesar. All right. We've left behind our Victorian bakers with their chalky loaves. Now, let's drift back much further. Over 2,000 years further, in fact. Tonight we're wandering into ancient Rome, to follow the long, winding, and occasionally absurd life of Gaius Julius Caesar. You've heard the name, of course. Caesar. The man who crossed the Rubicon. The man who conquered Gaul. The man who was stabbed to death in a rather undignified pile-up involving his closest friends. But if we strip away the marble statues and the heroic paintings, what we're left with is a person. And like most people who managed to claw their way to absolute power, Caesar's life was messy. So let's begin quietly. Not with the daggers in the Senate. Not even with the Rubicon. But with a slightly frail little boy, born into a middling Roman family in 100 BCE. The Caesars were not the most important family in Rome. They were patricians, old nobles, but not the glamorous kind. By the time Julius was born, the family was respectable but unremarkable. Think of them as minor aristocrats with fading social clout. His father, also called Gaius Julius Caesar, because Romans had the imagination of a brick, was a provincial governor. His mother, Aurelia, was from a better-connected family and seems to have been the real backbone of the household. Little Julius grew up in a Rome that was chaotic even by Roman standards. The Republic was technically in charge, but it was wobbling on its legs. Civil wars kept erupting, ambitious generals kept marching on Rome, and senators spent more time stabbing each other politically than governing anything. In this turbulent world, Caesar's childhood was shaped by politics. He was connected to powerful figures through his mother, and before long, he was linked by marriage too. He married Cornelia, the daughter of Cinna, one of Rome's leading populist politicians. This seemed like a good idea at the time. Unfortunately, when the dictator Sulla came to power, it was suddenly a very bad idea. Sulla hated Cinna's supporters. And so he ordered young Caesar to divorce Cornelia. Divorce or die, that was the offer. Caesar, to his credit, or perhaps his arrogance, refused. He was only a teenager, but he defied the most dangerous man in Rome. Sulla, baffled, spared him. Legend has it Sulla muttered something about Caesar having many Mariuses in him, meaning he saw shades of another populist troublemaker. It was not meant as a compliment. But it did mean Caesar lived. Which was, all things considered, useful for the rest of the story. After this brush with death, Caesar did what many ambitious young men did. He joined the army. Soldiering toughened him up. He served in Asia Minor and distinguished himself in battle. On one occasion, he was sent to negotiate with pirates who had kidnapped him. They demanded a ransom. Caesar, offended by how low the ransom was, insisted they raise it. Then, after he was freed, he returned with a fleet, captured the pirates, and, because he had promised them, had them crucified. But in a kind of casual mercy, he first had their throats cut, so the crucifixion wouldn't be too agonizing. Which tells you a lot about Caesar's sense of humor. He wasn't cruel for the sake of it. He was just Roman. Eventually, Caesar returned to Rome and began climbing the political ladder. Roman politics was a brutal sport. Campaigns cost money. Money Caesar did not have. He was always in debt. Permanently in debt. To the point where some friends wondered if he'd ever escape it. But Caesar had charisma. He was witty, eloquent, charming. He spent money he didn't have on public games and feasts. He made himself visible. Popular. Dangerous. Step by step, he rose, quaestor, aedile, praetor. Each rung of the ladder brought more debt, but also more influence. His speeches swayed crowds. His generosity won loyalty. And behind the charm, he was calculating. He knew how to flatter. He knew when to bend, and when to stand firm. And then, of course, there was his private life. Caesar was married multiple times. After Cornelia's death, he married Pompeia. That ended badly when she was implicated in a scandal during a women-only festival. Caesar divorced her with the famous line, "Caesar's wife must be above suspicion." Which sounds noble, until you remember he was spectacularly unfaithful himself. In fact, Caesar had so many affairs that he became notorious for it. His favorite conquest, allegedly, was Queen Cleopatra of Egypt. His soldiers joked that he was the husband of all wives, and the wife of all husbands. Which was not intended as a compliment. Politically, Caesar made one of the smartest moves of his life in 60 BCE. He formed an alliance with two powerful men, Pompey the Great, Rome's leading general, and Crassus, Rome's richest man. Together, they were unstoppable. This first triumvirate wasn't official, but it ran Rome. Caesar got himself elected consul, Rome's top office, and used the year to ram through laws that favored his allies. When his term ended, he secured a governorship over Gaul, which gave him something far more valuable than politics, an army. And with that army, Caesar did what ambitious men always do. He made himself a legend. The Gallic Wars lasted nearly a decade. Caesar marched into what is now France, Belgium, parts of Switzerland, and beyond. He crushed tribes, built bridges, crossed rivers, wrote dispatches about his victories in elegant Latin. The commentaries on the Gallic War remain classics, though they are essentially propaganda. Caesar describes himself as calm, decisive, heroic. His enemies are barbarians. His triumphs are inevitable. But even propaganda cannot hide the brutality. Whole villages were massacred. Populations enslaved. At one point, he besieged the Gallic leader Vercingetorix at Alesia, building walls around the city, and then, walls around those walls, to trap both the defenders and any outside reinforcements. Vercingetorix surrendered, noble and defiant. Caesar paraded him through Rome in chains, and then had him executed. Which was, again, very Roman. By the time Caesar finished in Gaul, he was immensely wealthy, wildly popular, and dangerously powerful. Pompey and the Senate began to worry. Crassus, the third partner in their alliance, had died fighting Parthians, which left a neat two-man rivalry. Pompey had the Senate. Caesar had his legions. The Senate ordered Caesar to disband his army and return to Rome. He knew what that meant: prosecution. Possibly execution. Once stripped of power, he was vulnerable. So in 49 BCE, Caesar made the decision that would echo through history. He marched his army south. At the Rubicon River, the boundary of Italy, he hesitated. Then, with a theatrical flourish, he crossed. "Let the die be cast," he reportedly said. It was civil war. The war was short and decisive. Pompey fled. Caesar pursued him across Greece, Egypt, and Spain. Along the way, Caesar met Cleopatra. She was young, ambitious, brilliant, and not above rolling herself up in a carpet to make an impression. Which worked. Their affair became infamous. She bore him a son, Caesar Ion, though Rome never quite accepted the child as legitimate. Meanwhile, Pompey was assassinated in Egypt. Caesar wept when he saw Pompey's severed head. Whether from genuine grief or political theater, we'll never know. But with Pompey gone, Caesar was supreme. Back in Rome, he was declared dictator. First for a year. Then 10 years. Then, effectively, for life. He reformed the calendar, giving us the Julian calendar that underpins our own. He packed the Senate with his supporters. He launched building projects, offered land to veterans, extended citizenship. And, crucially, he acted like a monarch in all but name. This worried people. Rome hated kings. They had overthrown one centuries earlier and never forgot it. Caesar's behavior, his golden chair in the Senate, his statues among the gods, felt uncomfortably close to monarchy. So in 44 BCE, a group of senators decided they'd had enough. They gathered on the Ides of March, daggers hidden in their togas. Caesar entered the Senate. They surrounded him. And in a frenzy, they stabbed. Plutarch claims he was stabbed 23 times. That he saw Brutus among them, and sighed, "You too, child?" More likely, he just collapsed under a hail of blows. A man bleeding out on the Senate floor, covered not in marble glory, but in confusion and betrayal. And that was the end of Julius Caesar. Sort of. Because his death did not restore the Republic, as the conspirators hoped. Instead, it sparked more civil wars. His adopted heir, Octavian, later Augustus, took power. The Republic was gone forever. The empire had begun. Caesar, in death, achieved what he had grasped for in life, immortality. His name became a title. Caesar. Later Kaiser. Later Tsar. His shadow lingered across centuries. But when we strip all that away, we're left with a man. A frail boy, nearly executed for refusing to divorce. A debt-ridden politician charming crowds. A ruthless general in Gaul. A lover of Cleopatra. A dictator who lasted less than a year. Julius Caesar, endlessly ambitious, often brilliant, occasionally petty, and fatally unwilling to stop climbing. And with that, let's drift onto another royal misadventure. The first Olympic Games in ancient Greece. So, we've drifted from chalk-filled Victorian bread to the bloody end of Julius Caesar. And now, let's settle in for something a little lighter. Or at least, lighter if you ignore the sweat, the nakedness, and the occasional fatal head injury. Tonight we're wandering back to the 8th century BCE, to ancient Greece. A world of city-states, of gods perched on Mount Olympus, and of men who thought running around in the heat without clothes was the height of civilization. Yes, we're talking about the very first Olympic Games. The Games, we're told, began in 776 BCE. That's the official date, though of course it's more legend than fact. Ancient Greeks were not in the habit of writing meticulous minutes and posting them online afterward. What we do know is that by the late 8th century, there was a tradition of athletic contests at Olympia, in the western Peloponnese. Now, Olympia was not a city. It wasn't even a village. It was more of a sacred grove, a site dedicated to Zeus. There was a temple, a great altar, and a scattering of buildings. It was a place people went to worship. Which, in Greek fashion, meant mixing prayer with blood sacrifices, banquets, and, naturally, athletics. Because nothing says piety like hurling a discus while your cousin bleeds a goat nearby. The earliest Olympic Games were modest affairs. A single event, in fact, the Stadion race. Roughly 200 meters of straight sprinting. One length of the stadium. That was it. One event, one winner, one name remembered. The first victor, tradition claims, was a cook named Coroebus. Yes, the very first Olympic champion was not a prince, not a warrior, but a man whose main qualification was making bread. Which feels oddly appropriate, considering our earlier bakers. Coroebus sprinted to victory, was crowned with an olive wreath, and achieved eternal fame. Though, sadly, nobody remembers his recipes. Over time, the games grew. By the 7th century BCE, new events had been added. Wrestling, boxing, chariot racing. The pentathlon, a grueling mix of running, discus, javelin, long jump, and wrestling, was introduced for those who couldn't decide how they wanted to suffer. And then there was the pancration. A no-holds-barred combination of boxing and wrestling that allowed almost anything. Punching, kicking, choking. The only things forbidden were biting and gouging eyes. Which tells you quite a lot about the Greek sense of sportsmanship. The pancration was brutal. Men were beaten unconscious, sometimes killed. The crowd loved it. Because of course they did. Nothing brings people together quite like watching two men strangle each other in honor of Zeus. Now, let's pause for a moment to picture the athletes. They competed naked. Entirely naked. Oiled up, gleaming in the sun. Which was practical. In a way, it showed off the body, reduced clothing tangles, and allowed for easy grappling. But it also meant the games had a distinct atmosphere. Spectators packed the stadium, cheering as naked men sprinted, leapt, and tackled each other. Women, officially, were not allowed to compete. Or even watch, if they were married. Unmarried women could attend, but married women caught at the games could face death. Which seems a touch extreme. Imagine sneaking into a stadium to watch athletics and being hurled off a cliff for your trouble. Of course, there were exceptions. A Spartan woman named Siniska famously bred horses that won in the chariot races, and the victory was recorded in her name. So technically, she became the first female Olympic champion. Though one suspects the credit went to the horses. The games were not just about athletics. They were also about politics. Greece was divided into dozens of city-states, which spent most of their time squabbling, raiding, or waging wars. But for the Olympics, a sacred truce was declared. Armies stood down. Roads were made safe. Athletes could travel to Olympia without fear of being ambushed. This truce was symbolic, of course. The city-states still hated each other. But for a few weeks every 4 years, they agreed to postpone the stabbing. Instead, they sent their best men to wrestle, run, and throw spears under the eyes of the gods. Winning at Olympia was the ultimate glory. Victors were crowned with a simple olive wreath, no gold, no money. But when they returned home, they were celebrated like heroes. Free meals, public statues, their names etched into history. For a poor farmer or a village cook, this was social mobility at its finest. One fast sprint, and suddenly you were immortal. The Olympics were also, predictably, corrupt. Bribery was rampant. Wealthy men tried to buy victories. Athletes were occasionally caught cheating. One famous case involved competitors who took money to deliberately lose. When discovered, they were fined. The fines were used to erect statues of Zeus, inscribed with moral lessons for future cheaters. Which was a very Greek solution, punish dishonesty with more stone monuments. There were also performance-enhancing methods. No, not steroids. Instead, diets of questionable meats, strange potions, and the occasional heaping dose of animal testicles, believed to improve strength. Ancient science at its finest. The atmosphere at Olympia must have been overwhelming. Tens of thousands of spectators crowded into the valley. There were no hotels, no neat rows of seating. People camped in tents, or simply lay on the ground. Vendors sold food. Priests performed sacrifices. Politicians gave speeches. Philosophers debated. The air was thick with smoke from burning meat, the stench of sweating athletes, and the roar of the crowd. It was not just a sporting event. It was a festival. A cultural fair. A giant, chaotic celebration of being Greek. The games continued, every 4 years, for over a millennium. Victors' names were recorded, generations of athletes competed, and Olympia became a symbol of unity in a fractured world. Of course, unity is relative. Sparta still fought Athens. The Persians still invaded. But every 4 years, the Greeks remembered they were part of something bigger. Something sacred. The games finally came to an end in 393 CE, when the Christian Emperor Theodosius decided they were a pagan festival and shut them down. Naked men wrestling in oil, it seems, was not in line with Christian values. The stadiums fell silent. The temples decayed. And for over 1,000 years, the Olympics vanished. Until, of course, the 19th century, when someone thought, let's bring back the naked wrestling, though maybe with shorts this time. And so the modern Olympics were born. But the first games, in that quiet valley of Olympia, were something else entirely. Not the global spectacle of today, with cameras, corporate sponsors, and suspiciously enthusiastic mascots. But a simpler thing. A sprint across a dusty track. A crown of olive leaves. A cook named Charybdis, puffing his way into history. So next time you watch the Olympics, with its billion-dollar stadiums and endless ceremonies, remember that it all began with one man running 200 meters in the heat, probably barefoot, possibly sweaty, definitely naked. And somehow, that was enough to echo across millennia. And with that image, oiled athletes, olive wreaths, and a cheering crowd under the summer sun, let's drift forward again, toward another curious tale from history's long parade of oddities. So, We've drifted through chalky Victorian bread, Julius Caesar's bloody ambition, and the sweaty naked races of ancient Olympia. Now it's time to wander into something more refined. Or, at least, it looked refined on the surface. Beneath it was still as messy, corrupt, and faintly poisonous as always. Tonight we're heading to Renaissance Florence. A city of bankers, painters, schemers, and the occasional plague outbreak. And at the center of it all, like a patient spider in its silk web, was the Medici family. The Medicis did not begin as aristocrats. Far from it. They were merchants, moneylenders, small-time bankers. The family name comes from medico, or doctor. Somewhere back in the fog of the Middle Ages, the family may have actually produced healers. But by the 14th century, the medicine was financial. And the patients were kingdoms. You see, Florence was a republic. Technically. Theoretically. But in practice, it was a stew of powerful families, each trying to pull the levers of government. You had the Albizzi, the Strozzi, the Pizzi, and, slowly rising among them, the Medici. The trick was banking. Florence thrived on trade, and with trade came money. The Medicis opened a bank, lent money to merchants, and grew rich. Then they made the smartest possible move: they became bankers to the Pope. Because if you want power in 15th century Europe, it helps to have God on your balance sheet. The first truly notable Medici was Giovanni de' Bicci. Giovanni was not flamboyant. He wasn't flashy. He was cautious, quiet, and slightly dull. Which, in banking, is perfect. Nobody wants an eccentric banker. Giovanni kept his head down, built the family fortune, and avoided unnecessary enemies. He supported public projects, paid for charitable works, and carefully polished the family's reputation. By the time he died in 1429, the Medici Bank was the most powerful in Europe. Branches in Venice, Rome, London, Bruges. Kings and princes borrowed from Giovanni. The Pope owed him money. Which, spiritually speaking, is a rather nice arrangement. Giovanni's son Cosimo, later known as Cosimo de' Medici, or Cosimo the Elder, was the one who transformed wealth into power. Cosimo was not a king. Not officially. Florence was still a republic, and he was merely a citizen. But he understood how to rule from behind the curtain. Cosimo made alliances. He funded artists, architects, philosophers. He patronized Brunelleschi, who designed Florence's famous cathedral dome, a dome so vast and improbable that even today, engineers marvel at it. Cosimo built libraries, filled them with books, and styled himself as a patron of learning. Which was convenient, since Renaissance intellectuals were expensive, but also flattered easily. Meanwhile, he ran the city. Not with official titles, though he held plenty, but with influence. Cosimo lent money to friends, to allies, to rivals. He forgave debts for loyalty. He used credit as a leash. Florence's politics became a web of obligations, all leading back to him. Enemies tried to stop him. The Albizzi family accused him of treason. In 1433, Cosimo was arrested and nearly executed. He only avoided death by bribing his jailer with enough money to feed the man's descendants for decades. He was exiled instead, sent away from Florence. But exile did not last. Without Cosimo, Florence's economy faltered. Merchants panicked. Within a year, the city begged him to return. Cosimo rode back in triumph, wealth intact, enemies ruined. From that point forward, the Medicis were untouchable. Cosimo ruled quietly for decades. He was never prince or duke. He was simply Cosimo, first citizen. But everyone knew who held the strings. By the time he died in 1464, he had transformed the family into Florence's de facto dynasty. He was buried with honors. The city declared him Pater Patriae, father of the fatherland. Which is a nice way of saying, yes, we know you basically ran the place. His son Piero was less effective. Known as Piero the Gouty, not the most flattering epithet, he spent much of his rule in pain, swollen and bedridden. Still, the family held on. Because the next generation was waiting. And waiting with enthusiasm. That next generation was Lorenzo. You may know him as Lorenzo the Magnificent. And magnificent he was. Magnificent in wealth. Magnificent in taste. Magnificent in the sense that he spent money like a drunken sailor with a winning lottery ticket. Lorenzo adored art. He funded Botticelli, Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo. He filled Florence with paintings, sculptures, frescoes. The Renaissance, in many ways, blossomed under his patronage. Florence became the cultural capital of Europe. Politically, Lorenzo was shrewd. He balanced alliances, played enemies against each other, and kept Florence safe. At least for a while. But his reign was not without drama. The most famous crisis came in 1478, the Pizzi conspiracy. The Pizzi family, tired of Medici dominance, plotted with others to kill Lorenzo and his brother Giuliano. The perfect moment, they decided, was during High Mass at the cathedral. Nothing says piety like a little assassination between hymns. The attack was brutal. Giuliano was stabbed to death, bleeding out on the church floor. Lorenzo, however, fought off his attackers and survived. Enraged, the people of Florence turned on the conspirators. Several were lynched. Others were hanged from the windows of government buildings. The message was clear: don't mess with the Medicis. Lorenzo emerged stronger than ever. The conspiracy had failed, and his legend only grew. Yet even Lorenzo could not secure permanent stability. His lavish spending drained the family coffers. Enemies circled. When he died in 1492, Florence soon erupted in turmoil. The most disruptive figure was not another family, but a preacher. Girolamo Savonarola, a Dominican friar, denounced the Medicis and their worldly luxuries. He railed against art, against wealth, against the very spirit of the Renaissance. And astonishingly, he gained followers. Crowds burned paintings, jewelry, fine clothes, the infamous bonfire of the vanities. The Medicis were expelled. For a while, it seemed the dynasty had ended. But if history has taught us anything, it's that wealthy families rarely vanish. They wait. They scheme. They marry strategically. And eventually, they return. The Medici comeback was gradual. Different branches of the family maneuvered. One line produced popes, Leo X and Clement VII, whose reigns were, let's say, colorful. Leo X once said, "Since God has given us the papacy, let us enjoy it." Which he did, lavishly. Clement, meanwhile, bungled things so thoroughly that Rome was sacked in 1527, shocking all of Europe. Back in Florence, the family finally cemented power with Cosimo I, who became Duke of Florence in 1537. From then on, the Medicis ruled openly, titles and all. The Republic was gone. Florence was a duchy, then later a Grand Duchy, wrapped tightly in Medici control. For 2 centuries, they reigned. They married into European royalty, spread their influence across courts, and produced endless lines of slightly mediocre successors. By the 18th century, the line fizzled out, childless, exhausted, decadent. But by then, the Medici name was immortal. What makes the Medici so fascinating is not just their wealth, or their art patronage, or even their political dominance. It's the way they blurred the line between money and power. They proved that you didn't need a crown or a battlefield to rule. Sometimes, all you needed was a ledger, a loan, and the patience to let everyone else fall into your debt. And perhaps the most delicious irony is this: the Medicis, bankers to kings, patrons of the Renaissance, rulers of Florence, began as ordinary merchants. People who sold cloth, lent coins, balanced books. From counting money to counting on power. A reminder that dynasties can sprout from the unlikeliest soil, if watered with enough gold. So that was the rise of the Medici family. From Giovanni's cautious banking to Lorenzo's glittering magnificence, through conspiracies, exiles, and resurrections, they reshaped Florence and Europe. And they left behind more than just a dynasty. They left domes, paintings, sculptures, and libraries. Silent monuments to a family who knew how to turn Florence into immortality. And with that, let's drift softly onward, to yet another figure in history's long parade of brilliance, absurdity, and occasional disaster. So, we've drifted through bakers and Caesars, Olympians and bankers. Now, let's wander into something stranger. Stranger, and honestly, a little sad. We're going to Spain in the late 17th century. The age of the Habsburgs. A dynasty so obsessed with keeping power in the family that, well, let's just say they took the phrase literally. Too literally. And the end result of all that dynastic recycling was Charles II of Spain. A king so fragile, so unfortunate, so medically confusing, that his very existence is still whispered about with a kind of horrified fascination. Charles was born in 1661, son of King Philip IV of Spain and Mariana of Austria. Which sounds fine, until you realize that Philip and Mariana were uncle and niece. Yes. Uncle. And niece. And not in the playful uncle sense. In the actual family dinner must have been very awkward sense. This was not unusual for the Habsburgs. For generations, they married cousins, uncles, nieces, anyone with a suitably royal title. The family tree had fewer branches than a broomstick. It was all about keeping the dynasty pure. Which, naturally, made everything worse. Charles was the culmination of this genetic gamble. From the moment of his birth, it was clear something was wrong. He was frail, sickly, his head was unusually large, his jaw protruded in the classic Habsburg jaw. He had trouble chewing, trouble speaking, and trouble, well, existing. Doctors didn't expect him to live past infancy. But Charles, to everyone's surprise, did live. He just didn't live well. As a child, he barely walked until he was 4. He didn't speak clearly until he was about 8. He was constantly ill, often bedridden, and always surrounded by doctors, priests, and worried courtiers. His mother, Mariana, kept him sheltered. She insisted he be treated like a normal heir, even as he clearly struggled with basic functions. And yet, because of dynastic rules, Charles was heir to the throne. When his father Philip IV died in 1665, little Charles became King of Spain. He was only 4 years old. Too young to rule, of course. So his mother served as regent, which essentially meant she ran the kingdom while Charles sat in his golden nursery chair. Spain at the time was already in decline. Its empire stretched across the globe, but its finances were collapsing. Wars drained the treasury, corruption was rampant, and the glory days of Spanish dominance were fading. And now, at the helm, was a child so fragile that he could barely stand upright in ceremonial robes. Not ideal. As Charles grew older, his condition became more obvious. He was intelligent enough to understand things, but he struggled to express himself. His jaw was so deformed he could hardly chew food. He drooled constantly. His body was weak, prone to seizures and mysterious illnesses. Courtiers whispered that he was cursed. Some claimed sorcery was involved. Because, of course, if you can't explain genetics, you might as well blame witches. The people called him El Hechizado, the Bewitched. Which is both poetic and cruel. Mariana, his mother, continued to dominate court politics, shielding her son from too much responsibility. Foreign ambassadors reported with barely concealed shock at the king's appearance. One described him as a walking corpse. Another said he looked like a man more dead than alive. Subtlety was not their strong suit. But Charles was king, and kings must marry. The first unlucky bride was Marie-Louise of Orleans, a French princess and niece of Louis XIV. She was young, beautiful, and reportedly horrified when she first saw her new husband. Their marriage was, unsurprisingly, not happy. Charles adored her, but his health and likely infertility meant no children arrived. Marie-Louise died after 10 years, at just 26, possibly from illness, or possibly from sheer despair. Charles remarried. His second wife was Maria Anna of Neuburg, a German princess. She was chosen because her family was known for producing many children. Fertility was her main qualification. But despite every prayer, ritual, and desperate medical treatment, no children ever came. The truth was simple: Charles was sterile. Generations of inbreeding had caught up. His body could not continue the line. The Spanish Habsburg dynasty, centuries old, was collapsing with him. Meanwhile, the kingdom itself withered. Spain's economy sputtered, wars dragged on, and rival powers circled. Charles, often bedridden, tried to govern but lacked the strength. He relied heavily on advisors, ministers, and priests. The court was a nest of intrigue, each faction trying to control the feeble king. And the people kept whispering. Sorcery, curses, divine punishment. Priests performed exorcisms, just in case. One report claimed Charles was fed potions containing powdered human skulls to restore his vigor. Naturally, it didn't work. By the 1690s, Charles was visibly deteriorating. His body was failing. His mind too, at times. In his final years, he could hardly chew or swallow. He suffered from seizures, swelling, intestinal problems, headaches, you name it. An autopsy after his death revealed a horrifying picture. His body was described as the most wretched human seen. His heart was tiny. His lungs corroded. His intestines rotted. His head was full of water. And, most tellingly, he had only one testicle, black as coal and shrunken, according to the report. Not exactly a royal epitaph. Charles died in 1700, at just 38 years old. With him died the Spanish Habsburg line. No children, no heirs. And his death plunged Europe into crisis. The War of the Spanish Succession erupted, as rival dynasties clawed for the vast empire he left behind. It took years of war to settle. Eventually, Spain passed to the Bourbons, a French dynasty. The Habsburg experiment in Spain, centuries of carefully arranged marriages and tightly clutched titles, ended in a whimper, not a bang. And so, Charles II of Spain remains a symbol. A symbol of what happens when dynasties care more about bloodlines than biology. A symbol of how wealth and power can't protect you from the consequences of generations of poor genetic planning. He was pitted, mocked, whispered about. And yet, in a way, he was also tragic. He hadn't asked for this role. He hadn't asked to be the product of generations of cousin marriages. He hadn't asked to be king. But he bore it, weakly, painfully, until the dynasty itself collapsed with him. So, as we drift away from Charles's sad, strange life, remember, even the grandest empires can be undone not by enemies, but by their own families. By the quiet accumulation of choices, generation after generation, until one unfortunate man becomes the living proof that dynastic obsession is, quite literally, unsustainable. And with that, let's drift softly onward, to the next chapter in our slow midnight wander through history's endless gallery of fascinating, flawed figures. So, we've drifted through Bakers and Caesars, Olympians, Medicis, and the unfortunate Charles II of Spain. Now let's move forward into the early 20th century. To Russia. To snow, palaces, and eventually, basements. The Romanovs had ruled Russia for over 300 years. They presided over vast lands, glittering courts, and millions of peasants who were mostly miserable. The dynasty began in 1613 with Michael Romanov and lumbered along through war, famine, reform, and vodka. By the late 19th century, they were still clinging on, more by inertia than brilliance. And at the very end of this line was Nicholas II. A man who, if you had to sum him up, was probably better suited to being a mild-mannered office clerk than an autocrat ruling 1/6 of the earth. Nicholas became Tsar in 1894. He was 26. His father, Alexander III, had been a towering, imposing figure. Nicholas was not. He was shy, awkward, and indecisive. His cousin later described him as wholly unfit to rule. Which, unfortunately, was correct. Still, Nicholas was earnest. He believed in autocracy, the idea that the Tsar should have absolute power, answerable only to God. Which would have been fine, maybe, in the 1600s. But in the 20th century, when revolutions were brewing and industrial workers were striking, it was a little out of touch. Nicholas married Alexandra, a German princess and granddaughter of Queen Victoria. She was deeply religious, reserved, and not exactly popular in Russia. To make matters worse, she was a Russian Orthodox by birth, and the people never really forgave her for being foreign. The couple did love each other, genuinely. Which is nice, because many royal marriages were cold, political arrangements. But their love story didn't save their dynasty. If anything, it trapped them in a bubble, cut off from reality, clinging only to each other, while the empire crumbled outside the palace gates. They had 5 children, 4 daughters, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, and finally, a son, Alexei. And here lies the central tragedy. Alexei was the heir, but he had hemophilia, a genetic disease passed down from Queen Victoria's family. His blood wouldn't clot properly. A small bruise could turn fatal. The royal family lived in constant fear. Every stumble, every nosebleed, every fall from a horse was a crisis. Doctors could do little. Alexandra, in particular, was consumed by anxiety for her son. And into this vacuum stepped Rasputin. Grigory Rasputin. The so-called mad monk. Dirty, bearded, foul-smelling, magnetic. A wandering holy man with hypnotic eyes and dubious hygiene. Somehow, he convinced Alexandra that he could heal Alexei. And to be fair, sometimes, mysteriously, he seemed to help. Whether it was hypnosis, or simply telling the doctors to stop bleeding the boy with leeches, who knows? But Rasputin's presence at court was disastrous. He became Alexandra's confidant, her supposed savior. Rumors spread. People whispered that he controlled the royal family. Some claimed he was Alexandra's lover. He wasn't, but the gossip didn't need truth to spread. For the public, the image of the Tsar's family being manipulated by a half-mystical peasant was devastating. It eroded what little faith remained in Nicholas's leadership. Meanwhile, Nicholas made political blunders. In 1905, workers marched peacefully in St. Petersburg, demanding better conditions. The protest ended in massacre, Bloody Sunday. Soldiers fired on unarmed crowds. Hundreds died. Trust in the Tsar evaporated. Nicholas was forced to grant limited reforms, a parliament called the Duma. But he resented it, undermined it, and clung to autocracy, which only deepened the anger. Then came World War I. A disaster for Russia. Millions of soldiers died, often poorly equipped, sometimes charging into battle without rifles. Nicholas made the fateful decision to personally command the army, which meant that every defeat was his fault. Meanwhile, he left governance in the hands of Alexandra and, indirectly, Rasputin. Not a great PR move. By 1917, things fell apart. Food shortages, strikes, mutinies. Soldiers deserted. The people were done. Revolution erupted. Nicholas abdicated in March, reluctantly giving up the throne. 3 centuries of Romanov rule ended in a single day. The family was placed under house arrest. At first, conditions were comfortable: palaces, servants, gardens. But as revolution radicalized, their situation worsened. By 1918, they were moved to Ekaterinburg, to a grim house called the Ipatov House. Guards surrounded them. Their world shrank to a handful of rooms. Nicholas wrote in his diary, simply, about the weather, the children's activities, small daily details. Almost as if ignoring reality. Alexandra prayed, clutched icons, and remained convinced that God would save them. Of course, God did not save them. On the night of July 16, 1918, the family was woken and told they were being moved for their safety. Instead, they were led to a basement. Nicholas, Alexandra, their children, and a few loyal servants stood together, bewildered. Then came gunfire. The execution was brutal, chaotic. Bullets ricocheted. The daughters, wearing dresses sewn with jewels for safekeeping, were partially shielded by the gems, and had to be finished off with bayonets. Within minutes, the dynasty was gone. The Romanovs, once the most powerful family in Russia, ended in a blood-stained basement, in a provincial town, at the hands of their own subjects. The bodies were buried in secret, hidden in the woods. For decades, their fate was obscured by myth. Rumors spread that Anastasia or another child had survived. Imposters appeared. Movies were made. But the truth was simple: they all died that night. In the 1990s, Their remains were finally identified and reburied with honors. The Russian Orthodox Church even canonized them as martyrs, which is an odd transformation, from autocrats to saints. The story of the Romanovs is both tragic and oddly inevitable. They were insulated, stubborn, out of touch. Nicholas was not a monster, but he was weak. Alexandra was not evil, but she was naive. They loved each other, but they couldn't adapt to the world changing around them. And so, like Charles II of Spain, the Romanovs show how dynasties can collapse not just from external enemies, but from within. From blindness, pride, and a refusal to face reality. One day you're in gilded palaces. The next, you're in a basement. History rarely bothers with gentle transitions. And with that, let's drift quietly away from the Romanovs. Another dynasty ended, another lesson written softly in history's margins. Where shall we go next? Perhaps to the glittering but absurd court of Louis XIV. Or maybe to the daily life of medieval peasants, who were too busy with mud, goats, and taxes to worry about jeweled dresses or Rasputin. Louis XIV in the theater of Versailles. So, we've walked with Romanovs to their basement, and with Habsburgs into genetic collapse. Perhaps it's time for something a little lighter. Still absurd. Still human. But in a way that sparkles rather than droops. Let's drift over to 17th century France. To a palace of gold, mirrors, fountains, wigs, and more lace than seems strictly necessary. To the court of Louis XIV, the Sun King. Louis XIV was born in 1638, to Louis XIII in Anne of Austria. He was called Dieudan, God-given, because his parents had struggled to produce an heir for 23 years. You can imagine the size of relief when a healthy boy finally arrived. His father died when he was only 4, and little Louis became king. Which, of course, meant his mother ruled as regent while Cardinal Mazarin, the chief minister, actually ran things. Louis's childhood was shaped by instability. Civil wars known as the Fronde broke out, and at one point, rebels stormed into his bedroom while he was sleeping. He never forgot the humiliation. It left him with a lifelong obsession: control. Absolute, glittering control. When Mazarin died in 1661, young Louis took power in his own hands. He was 22. And he announced that he would rule alone. No chief minister. No overmighty advisor. Just him. And he did. For over 70 years. The longest reign of any monarch in European history. Louis understood something important: kingship is theater. It's not enough to rule. You have to be seen ruling. You have to radiate majesty. You have to convince everyone that you are not just a man in tights, but the very embodiment of France itself. And Louis chose a symbol, the sun. He was the Sun King. The center of the universe. All light emanated from him. Everyone else revolved in his orbit. Subtlety was not his strong point. Versailles became the stage. Originally just a hunting lodge outside Paris, Louis transformed it into a palace so vast and ornate that visitors gawked in disbelief. Hallways stretched for miles. The Hall of Mirrors glittered with candlelight reflected endlessly. Gardens sprawled with fountains, statues, and carefully trimmed hedges. Versailles was not just a home. It was a machine. A machine for controlling the nobility. You see, France's nobles were powerful and unruly. In earlier times, they had rebelled against kings, led armies, and generally made a nuisance of themselves. Louis had no interest in being threatened. So he invited them all to Versailles. Or rather, compelled them. There, they were drowned in etiquette. Every gesture, every glance, every ribbon on their sleeve became part of a rigid hierarchy of privilege. Nobles competed not for armies or provinces, but for the honor of handing the king his shirt in the morning. Yes, literally. The king's daily routine was a ritual. When he woke, nobles were admitted in stages. Some had the honor of watching him put on his shoes. Others, of handing him his gloves. It was called the levee, the rising. At night, the coucher, the going to bed, was performed with equal ceremony. Louis turned getting dressed into a political system. If you were close enough to see him button his cuffs, you were clearly in favor. If you were stuck waiting in the hallway while someone else fetched his wig, you were slipping down the ladder. It sounds absurd. And it was. But it worked. The nobles, once dangerous, became tame courtiers. They squabbled over petty privileges, leaving real power firmly in Louis's hands. And oh, the wigs. Louis began losing his hair young. Instead of fretting, he set a trend: elaborate, flowing wigs, piled high in powdered white. Soon every courtier wore one. Wigs became bigger, clearer, more elaborate. Sometimes 2 feet tall. Entire forests of hair wobbling through Versailles. A good wig cost a fortune and required constant maintenance. But if the king did it, everyone had to. Fashion at Versailles was a weapon. Louis spent lavishly on silks, velvets, lace, jewels. His courtiers bankrupted themselves trying to keep up. Which, of course, left them financially dependent on him. Very convenient. Louis also loved spectacle. Ballets, operas, feasts, fireworks. He danced on stage himself as a young man, dressed as the rising sun, radiating golden rays. The Sun King indeed. Courtiers applauded wildly, as if he had reinvented dancing. Nobody dared yawn. Food at Versailles was legendary. Banquets stretched for hours. Courses upon courses, roasts, pastries, fruits, cheeses, wines. Etiquette dictated how you ate, who you sat beside, and even how you chewed. Discreetly, one hopes. Behind the scenes, however, hygiene was less glamorous. Versailles had hundreds of rooms but very few toilets. Guests often relieved themselves in hallways, stairwells, or fireplaces. Perfume was everywhere, not just as a luxury, but as camouflage. So, yes, the most elegant palace in Europe was also faintly smelly. Louis's reign was not all glitter, of course. He fought wars. Many wars. Too many wars. He expanded France's territory, but at enormous cost. Soldiers died in droves. Taxes soared. Ordinary peasants bore the brunt, scraping by while nobles fluttered in silk. Religiously, Louis revoked the Edict of Nantes in 1685, which had given Protestants some toleration. Hundreds of thousands of Protestants fled France, many to England or the Netherlands, taking their skills and wealth with them. Not the wisest economic policy. But Louis liked uniformity. Religious, political, personal. In his private life, Louis was equally extravagant. He had one wife officially, Maria Theresa of Spain, who dutifully produced heirs. But he also had a parade of mistresses, favorites, and acknowledged illegitimate children. He treated them generously, showering them with titles and estates. Versailles was, in many ways, both palace and soap opera. And yet, through all of this, Louis maintained an aura of majesty. Visitors left awestruck. Foreign ambassadors bowed, dazzled, and humiliated in equal measure. Louis made France the cultural capital of Europe. French became the language of diplomacy. French fashion, art, and manners spread everywhere. But time, inevitably, caught up. Louis reigned so long that he outlived most of his legitimate heirs. His son died. His grandsons died. By the end, only a great-grandson remained to inherit. When Louis finally died in 1715, at the age of 76, he had been king for 72 years. Think of that. Almost 3/4 of a century. Generations lived and died under his rule. His last words, reportedly, were, "I have loved war too much." A rare admission of fault, whispered from a man who had spent a lifetime insisting he was the center of the universe. Louis XIV remains a paradox. Brilliant and wasteful. Majestic and petty. He built Versailles, a jewel of art and architecture, yet filled it with endless gossip about who got to pass him a handkerchief. He made France dazzling, but also exhausted it. And he left behind a system so rigid and so unequal that, a few generations later, it collapsed entirely in the French Revolution. Versailles became a symbol of excess, of detachment, of rulers who mistook theater for reality. So as we drift away from Versailles tonight, picture the Hall of Mirrors at dusk. Candles flickering, wigs swaying, courtiers bowing, while outside, peasants trudge through fields, hungry and overtaxed. A palace of glass and gold, perched above a kingdom quietly cracking. History, as always, balancing the magnificent and the absurd.